you got the Republicans in charge and they raise the taxes. You get the Democrats in charge, they raise the taxes.
Yeah.
You know, and the corruption in the halls of Congress are just incredible. Good example again is on corruption of the government is the United Nations.
Hmm.
It's one of the most corrupt organizations on the planet Earth.
Well, it's a funny phrase because I think about that often. United Nations, you can talk about all different governments, agencies, institutions, of how corrupt they are.
Yeah,
I think I'm taking a view doing this show kind of where I've been at, that like we say those words, but really all we're saying is like humans are corrupt. It's just that over and over again. It doesn't
yes,
matter the institution, it doesn't matter the group. We're just humans are corrupt. And that's where,
absolutely.
right? Like that seems to
Yeah,
be the view of it. And that's where I wonder, like, I keep thinking humility has a part to play in this because if
it
we can
does.
all acknowledge that like, hey, we're all corrupted. Almost, you mentioned faith, right? The
Yeah,
original sin concept, the idea that
right.
there is corruption in us inherently.
Yes.
That seems to be the answer. How do you think about that? How big is humility
I
in
think you're right. Humility would play a whole big role in being humble. I think it would play a big role in changing things. And again, it starts at the top,
Mhm.
comes down. You know, there's an old phrase that I like to use a lot is the the philosophy of the classroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the government in the next generation.
Mhm.
So we need to educate our kids better than what we're doing now with all the nonsense that's going on with woke and CRT and all that other nonsense that's going on. We need to teach our kids reading, writing, and arithmetic. We need to teach them that trade schools are as good as colleges because not everybody's college material. Trade schools will be better for them, but they're getting so pressured to go to college, and with the government handling all the loans for college, it's just wide open for corruption.
Mhm.
If they weren't guaranteed all that money, the college price of tuition would come down because there'd be competition.
Mhm.
Right now, there's no competition.
Yeah, it's
Pure
interesting.
capitalism.
It's interesting coming off of that humility word. And I say this just hopefully you know by now. I love exploring. I love trying to understand it and getting to better things.
That's
So
fine.
I
Yeah.
don't claim to have the answers. It's just I think the interesting
No,
questions. Off of that humility point, which I think you and I both agree how important it is,
yeah.
as you then talk about the issues, and I'm not suggesting you're right, wrong, or indifferent, but like the
No.
CRT, the woke movement, there seemed to be, and correct me, like a bit of emotion in that, right? Of like, that stuff is dangerous. And we could talk about that for sure.
Yeah.
But I wonder, again, not suggesting you're wrong, but when I think of humility, it's not allowing that emotion and that conviction to take over to say it in that way. I may be way misinterpreting into what you just said, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like, how do you think about that? How humility
Yeah.
plays into that
I
piece of it?
see what you're saying. Humility to me is more than just being a footstool, a placemat.
Right. Yep.
You know, you have to stand up for what you believe in, and you have to be sincere. And humility is you don't try to take over.
Mm.
You don't try to go with the crowd, but you don't try to take over from the people that are running things by force or subterfuge or whatever means you want to use. If things go that way and you end up in the leadership position, that's a different proposition. And that comes from being humble and saying, this is what I believe, this is the way I believe it, and accept the fact that somebody's going to disagree with you.
Mm.
And say, okay, you have that right. I understand. We can just disagree on this.
Yep. Yep.
That's being humble.
Yeah. I wonder how often though this comes up a lot on this show, like the things you've been saying throughout the show, which I think there's so much they make a lot of sense. Some of the aspects of how the patterns of human nature and power and how we need to be somewhat skeptical of leadership and authority. I can imagine there's people listening that are like, yeah, I agree with that. And then go to the next step to say that's why perhaps some of the social issues are things that you don't agree with. They feel they're necessary. They feel like they need to kind of buck the system. They feel like they need to drive change, very much in the spirit of what you're saying. I know at some point it comes down to like a value system or fundamental beliefs on certain of these topics. Faith comes into it. It's very complicated. But um, Do you see that? Like, is there any empathy for that to say, like, they may be looking at it just the way I am, they just have a slightly different perspective on it?
Yes, I do have empathy for them, and because I understand them. They've got a driving need to what they see to improve things as they see as being dishonest
Hmm.
or abusive or prejudicial or something like, and they're trying to rectify that. The stereotypes of LBGTL. I can't do the number letters, but the gay movement. Okay, I sympathize with them. I understand. I don't sympathize, but I empathize with them. I understand that they've been put down, they've been abused, they've been crucified, and they want to do things to rectify that, and that's okay with me. But I believe some of them are going too far. Okay, that's my whole thing right there. Is they're pushing it too hard, too fast, too hard, too
Yeah.
far. Going too I mentioned CRT and the woke thing, that's pushing it too fast, too hard. Americans are not going to react to that, when uh, positively towards the past movement of Americans accept change slowly. And all humans accept change slowly. No human I know of that I've ever met like to change things. And when things are forced upon them to change, they react. They don't
Yeah.
act, they react.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I like that you're speaking of it of there's some people perhaps that went too far. I think that gets back to the human nature we spoke about earlier, right? People are people at the end of the day. And when there's
Yeah.
opportunities for power or different dynamics, people are going to do different things. And I just think, and I don't say this to claim a solution or a conclusion or judgment or anything in that. To me, there's something perhaps beautiful in the irony of it, perhaps not, perhaps ugly in the irony of it. But like, as you're explaining that, there's something in it where it's like, Americans don't like change. And I get that. And most people don't like change. And there's a comfort to it. And I don't think you say that from a place of like hatred or anger or vitriol or anything like
No.
that. Right. I get that. But there are people arguably who are suffering in some ways.
Yes.
And they feel like, I wish I could have the luxury to wait for this change to take effect, but I'm the one suffering. I need to do
Mhm.
something. Right.
Right.
And that's the part where it's like, there's so many similarities, there's so many overlaps to at the end of the day, people just don't want to see humans suffer, I think, is at the
No.
root of it, if they don't have to, right? If there's no unnecessary
Right.
suffering has to be there. So not so much a question there, but just, as you say that, that's what comes to mind.
You know, I have no animosity towards anybody. I have no anger towards any group. Well, I have some resentment for some groups. I don't have any hatred or anger. That is not my part of who I am. To be, my sister was gay, so I understand them very well. I have no anger at any group. What I do have is some frustrations about some of the programs they're putting forth. CRT for one, uh, this thing about reparations.
Can I ask Dale, and I ask again completely genuinely, because I get it, it's a super
Yeah,
complex, nuanced issue.
it is.
The view you have on it, less the view, right? Although explain it as best as needed. The conviction of it, again, it's one of those where I'm not judging it. I could hear the emotion in your voice as you talk about
Mhm.
it, and I can tell from this conversation you're a thoughtful person. You do think about these things. Where does that come? Even if you came out on the end that said, I think CRT is wrong. I think reparations isn't something that's necessary. There's almost fear in it to some extent. What's at the root of that, you think?